The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was always thick, a cloying blend of disinfectant and something far less sterile. Tonight, it felt heavier, like a sardine blanket draped over my shoulders. Detective Miller stood by the stainless steel table, his usual gruff demeanor softened by a weary confusion that mirrored my own growing unease. He gestured with a gloved hand towards the body. "This is unusual, William," he said, his voice low. Miller wasn't one for hyperbole. If he called something unusual, it usually meant it was so far off the charts it didn't even have a category. I'd been called in because the initial responders, even the seasoned ones, were stumped. A locked room, no forced entry, and a victim who, by all accounts, lived a life so isolated it was practically a ghost story. The victim's name was Arthur Finch, a cryptographer whose reputation preceded him in certain hushed circles, but who actively shunned the world. His apartment, a fortress of security systems and paranoia, had been found sealed from the inside. Yet here he was, undeniably dead. I approached the table, my gaze sweeping over the scene. Finch lay still, his eyes wide open, staring at the sterile ceiling. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no defensive wounds that screamed foul play. The me had already done their preliminary work, but they'd left the details for me. That was the deal. I handled the microscopic, the chemical, the things the naked eye missed. But this felt like it needed more than just a microscope. "What's the preliminary?" I asked, my voice steady, though a prickle of something akin to dread was starting to crawl up my spine. "No obvious trauma," Miller replied, rubbing his jaw. "Methinks it might be poison, but they're running tests. Nothing obvious on the surface. No signs of a break-in. Windows latched, door bolted from the inside. Security system logs show no breaches. It's like he just stopped. That was a polite way of saying murdered. And if he was murdered, how did the killer get in and out of a locked room? My mind, trained to dissect evidence, to find the logical progression, hit a wall. I knelt down, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. My eyes scanned Finch's body, then the immediate surroundings. The room was sparse, meticulously tidy, as if designed to offer no hiding places, no points of ingress. The only anomaly, the only thing that screamed louder than the silence, was on the small table beside the bed. On it, written in Finch's own precise, spidery hand, was a string of characters. Not words, not numbers, but a jumble of symbols that looked like an ancient language plucked from a forgotten tomb. It was a cipher, a complex one by the looks of it. "This is what the first officers found?" I asked, pointing. "Yeah, sitting right there. Like he left it for us," Miller said, his tone laced with incredulity. "We had our best codebreakers look at it. They said it's unlike anything they've ever seen. Untouchable, they called it. Untouchable." The word hung in the air. I leaned closer, my forensic training kicking in, overriding the growing sense of the surreal. My eyes traced the intricate patterns, the deliberate spacing. It wasn't just random scribbles. There was a system here, a hidden order, but what order? And what did it have to do with Finch's death? He was a cryptographer, I mused aloud. Maybe he left us a message. A message to who, William? And how did anyone get in to kill him in the first place? Miller's frustration was palpable. He needed answers, a tangible trail. And all we had was a dead man and a puzzle. I carefully picked up the paper, placing it in an evidence bag. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size. This wasn't just a clue. It felt like the key to everything, and yet it was also the lock itself. My own internal monologue, usually a calm, analytical stream, was a jumble of questions. How could a room be locked from the inside with no other exit? If it was poison, how was it administered without leaving a trace, without Finch fighting back? And this cipher, was it a confession, a warning, or a taunt, watchful, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to unravel its secrets? I looked back at Finch, his lifeless eyes still fixed on the ceiling. He was the ultimate enigma, and his death had only deepened the mystery. I had a feeling this case was going to be different, very different. My gut, usually a reliable compass, was spinning. I took a deep breath, the sterile air doing little to clear the fog in my mind. Time to get to work. The chill of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, always seeped into my bones, no matter how many times I worked a scene like this. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the quiet, the sterile scent of disinfectant battling the fainter, more primal odors. Miller, the detective, was already pacing, his heavy footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. He hated these puzzles, the ones that didn't leave a clear narrative of violence. He wanted blood spatter patterns, a point of entry, a struggle. What he had was a locked room and a dead cryptographer. I was already at the stainless steel table, my gloved hands hovering over the victim. The county medical examiner had done their initial work, documenting the obvious, but the real story, the one that mattered to me, was in the microscopic details. The victim, a man named Elias Thorne, lay still, his eyes open, staring at the fluorescent hum above. No visible trauma beyond what the someone had noted a single, precise puncture wound at the base of his skull, almost surgical. The pathologist had confirmed no weapon was found. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. It was as if he'd simply ceased. Anything, William. Miller's voice, gruff with exhaustion and impatience, cut through my concentration. I didn't look up. My focus was on the victim's skin, the subtle discoloration, the faint network of veins just beneath the surface. Still too early to tell, Miller. The has bagged and tagged, but I need to run my own series of tests. We're looking for trace evidence, anything out of place. I reached for a sterile swab, gently swiping a small area of skin near the puncture wound. The instructions from the they were clear. No obvious signs of external contamination. But obvious wasn't a word I trusted in my line of work. I'd seen too many things overlooked, too many details dismissed until they became the linchpin of a case. My eyes scanned Thorne's body again. His hands were clean, nails meticulously trimmed. No fibers, no dirt. It was unnerving how pristine he was, considering the circumstances. Except for the small, almost imperceptible smudge of what looked like graphite dust on his left index finger. I leaned closer, my breath misting slightly in the cold air. It was too fine to be from regular pencil use. It had a metallic sheen under the harsh light. Miller, I said, my voice low, did I find anything on him, anything at all that seemed unusual besides the obvious? He stopped pacing, leaning against a counter. Just the papers on his desk, that cipher, and his personal effects. Wallet, keys, the usual, nothing out of the ordinary. This graphite dust, I mused, pointing with a sterile probe. It's very fine, almost like it's from a specific type of lubricant or a specialized pencil. Miller grunted. A cryptographer, probably messing with some fancy gadget. What does it matter? Everything matters, Miller, I replied, my gaze fixed on the smudge. It was a tiny anomaly, easily missed, but it prickled at the back of my mind. Thorne was reclusive, yes, but his life revolved around precision, around code. A man like that wouldn't have random dust on his finger. I carefully collected a sample of the dust, placing it in a separate, clearly labeled vial. Then I moved on to Thorne's clothing. The pathologist had noted it was undisturbed, but I needed to be sure. I ran my gloved fingers over the fabric, feeling for any irregularities. The victim was wearing a simple dark wool sweater and trousers. No hidden pockets, no loose threads. But as I examined the inside of the sweater's collar, my fingers brushed against something stiff. I carefully turned the collar outward. Sewn into the fabric, almost invisible unless I was looking for it, was a tiny metallic tag. It was no bigger than a fingernail clipping, etched with a series of symbols that looked vaguely familiar, like a stylized circuit diagram. My brow furrowed. This was odd. Thorne was known for his aversion to modern technology, preferring analog methods and paper. Why would he have something like this sewn into his clothing? "What's that?" Miller asked, seeing my intense focus. "Something unexpected," I said, carefully photographing the tag before gently prying it loose with tweezers. I held it up to the light. The symbols were intricate, almost impossibly small. They weren't letters, not numbers, not any known alphabet. They felt like a language in themselves. I bagged the tag, adding it to the growing collection of anomalies. The puncture wound, the graphite dust, the hidden tag. They were all pieces, but I couldn't see the picture they were meant to form. The room was locked from the inside, no forced entry, no weapon, and now a dead man with strange symbols on his collar. And that cipher, it still sat on my workbench, a taunting, silent challenge. I turned back to Thorne's body. Someone had performed their initial examination, but there were internal details I needed to investigate myself. The puncture wound. It was so precise, so clean. I requested a full toxicology screen, but I had a feeling this wasn't about poison. This was something more direct. If the room was locked from the inside, and no one could have gotten in or out, then how was the killer, or whatever killed him, able to leave? It was a question that gnawed at me, a fundamental contradiction in the evidence that made my stomach clench. Miller was right. We had a dead man and a puzzle, and this puzzle was starting to feel a lot more complex and a lot more dangerous than I'd initially assumed. The fluorescent hum of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m. single overhead light was a familiar lullaby, though tonight it felt more like a dirge. The air, thick with the sterile tang of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and final, pressed in on me. I leaned over the stainless steel table, my breath misting slightly in the cool air. The victim, Finch, lay still, a canvas of unanswered questions, but my focus wasn't on the stillness of his body. It was on the frantic energy of the symbols he'd left behind. The cipher. It was a mess of interlocking geometric shapes and what looked like stylized runes, scrawled on a crumpled piece of paper clutched in his rigor mortised hand. It was beautiful in a terrifying, alien way. Not just random scribbles, but deliberate, intricate. Thorne, the cryptographer, hadn't just been murdered. He'd been trying to communicate, or perhaps he'd been trying to hide something. My colleague, Miller, a man whose patience I often envied, was meticulously cataloging Thorne's belongings in the adjacent room. I could hear the faint crinkle of plastic as he bagged evidence. He'd been the one to find the smudge I'd fixated on, a faint, oily residue on Finch's index finger. We'd sent it off for analysis, but my gut told me the real answer wasn't in a lab. It was right here, in this cryptic scrawl. I pulled out my own kit, the familiar weight of my tools a small comfort. A magnifying glass, tweezers, sterile swabs. I carefully lifted the paper, handling it as if it were spun glass. The paper itself was thick, expensive stock, not something I'd expect a recluse to keep lying around. And the ink, it was a deep, almost iridescent blue, unlike anything I'd seen before. Not ballpoint, not fountain pen. I ran a gloved finger lightly over the dry ink. It felt slightly raised, almost like a very fine embossing. Anything, William. Miller's voice, a low rumble, cut through my concentration. I shook my head, not looking up. Just a lot of very angry squiggles. This isn't a standard substitution cipher. It's not even close to anything I've encountered in my training. This is bespoke. I laid a fresh sheet of paper on the table and began to sketch, meticulously copying each symbol. My hand moved with practiced precision, but my mind raced. Thorne was a master of codes, of hidden languages. If he'd created this, he'd also created the key, but where? In his apartment, we'd found no obvious cipher key, no hidden notebooks filled with Rosetta Stones. It was as if the solution had vanished with him. My gaze drifted back to the victim. The position of his body, the way his fingers were curled around the paper. It spoke of a struggle, or perhaps a desperate attempt to hold onto something vital. But there was no sign of forced entry. The apartment had been sealed from the inside, a classic locked room scenario. Except the room wasn't locked anymore, was it? Because the killer had left and Thorne hadn't. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of my investigation. What if the cipher was the key? Not just to a message, but to the method of entry or exit. What if Thorne had been trying to tell us how it was done? I held the paper up to the harsh light, tilting it, searching for any hidden watermarks, any faint indentations that might suggest a secondary layer of meaning. Nothing, just the ink, stark and defiant. The smudge on his finger, I murmured, more to myself than to Miller. Oily, almost waxy, and this ink, it's not like anything I've ever used. I tapped a particularly complex symbol with my pen. This isn't just about letters and numbers. This feels dimensional. Miller reappeared in the doorway holding a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside, a single tarnished silver locket. Found this tucked into his sock. No photos inside, just empty. I took the bag, turning it over in my hands. Empty. Just like Thorne's apartment, stripped bare of any obvious personal effects. He was a ghost, living a life of digital shadows, and now he was literally a ghost. But ghosts didn't leave smudges on their fingers or clutch cryptic messages. My eyes scanned the cipher again. There were recurring patterns, certain symbols that appeared more frequently than others. My forensic training screamed for a systematic approach, frequency analysis, pattern recognition. But this felt different. This felt like Thorne had deliberately bypassed the rules. He'd built his own language, his own world, and he'd invited someone into it, or someone had forced their way in. I started to trace the lines of a particular symbol, a loop with 3 sharp points. It was almost like a stylized fingerprint or a circuit diagram. What if Thorne hadn't been writing a message in the traditional sense? What if he'd been drawing instructions? "Miller," I said, my voice tight. "Did I find any electronics that seemed out of place? Anything that looked custom-built?" He frowned, thinking. There was that odd server rack in his study. Looked older than the rest of his tech, but it was humming. We bagged it. Why? My gaze snapped back to the cipher, the loop, the sharp points, the way the symbols interlocked, not just side by side, but overlapping, building upon each other. It wasn't a linear message. It was a schematic, a blueprint, and the smudge on his finger. If it was waxy, perhaps it was residue from something he'd been handling. Something connected to this very intricate, very dangerous code. The tension in the room, already palpable, ratcheted up another notch. I felt it coiling in my stomach, a knot of unease and sudden realization. Thorne wasn't just a victim. He was a puzzle maker, and his final act was to leave us the pieces. But the picture they formed. I had a terrible feeling it was going to be far more complex and far more deadly than any of us could have imagined. I carefully placed the cipher back into its protective sleeve. The answer was here, I knew it. But understanding it felt like trying to read a language I'd never even heard of. And the clock, I sensed, was ticking. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. It clung to my nostrils, a constant reminder of why I was here, why I'd been called in at this ungodly hour. The body of the cryptographer, Finch, lay under a sheet, a silent testament to the puzzle he'd left behind. My own puzzle. My gaze snapped back to the cipher, the loop, the sharp points. It was a schematic, a blueprint. If it was waxy, perhaps it was residue from something he'd been meticulously crafting, but crafting what and for whom? I'd spent the last few hours poring over Finch's physical workspace. Dust motes danced in the harsh beam of my flashlight, illuminating a scene of meticulous, almost obsessive order. Books on obscure mathematics lined the shelves, their spines uncracked. Diagrams, intricate and baffling, were pinned to a corkboard, all connected by red string that formed an unsettling web. But no obvious weapon, no sign of struggle, no forced entry. Just the locked room and that maddening cipher. The county coroner, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with weariness, hovered near the doorway, his arms crossed. He'd seen me go through Finch's pockets, examine his fingernails, and now I was staring at the cipher itself, a small, laminated card I'd found clutched in Finch's dead hand. "Anything, William." His voice was a low rumble, barely disturbing the heavy quiet. I shook my head, not taking my eyes off the card. "It's more than just a message. It's a design. But for what?" I traced a symbol with my gloved fingertip. It looked like a stylized key, but with too many tumblers. The coroner sighed. "Looks like gibberish to me. Kid was eccentric, everyone said so, probably just his way of going out." I bristled. "Eccentricity doesn't kill people, coroner, and it certainly doesn't create locked room mysteries." I looked at Finch's hand again. The smudge. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. A faint, grayish residue. I'd scraped a tiny sample. Back at the lab, under the microscope, it had resolved into microscopic particles. Not ink, not paint, something else. Something granular, like finely ground metal or perhaps dust, but not ordinary dust. This had a peculiar crystalline structure. "I need to see his computer," I stated, my voice firm, "and anything else digital he owned. His phone, hard drives, cloud accounts, the works. If he was hiding something, it's not on paper." The coroner nodded, already reaching for his radio. "We'll get the tech guys to bag it all. But I'm telling you, William, this is a dead end. The man was a ghost even before. Well, you know, a ghost. Maybe, but ghosts left echoes, and in the digital realm those echoes could be deafening. Back in my own lab, the sterile hum of the equipment was a welcome contrast to the oppressive silence of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light. The computer tower, sleek and black, sat on my workbench. Finch had been meticulous, just as his apartment had suggested. The tower was clean, no obvious signs of tampering. But I knew better than to trust appearances. Booting it up was the first hurdle. No password prompt, that was odd. Finch was a cryptographer. He'd surely secure his work. Unless he'd left it intentionally open. A trap or a desperate plea, the desktop was sparse. A single folder labeled Project Nightingale. My gut tightened. This had to be it. Inside, a dizzying array of encrypted files. Hundreds of them, each with a different extension, a different naming convention. Some looked like plain text documents, others like image files, and some were just strings of random characters. I ran my decryption tools, a standard suite I developed over the years. Most of them bounced back, spitting out error messages. Finch's encryption was beyond anything I'd encountered. It wasn't just strong, it was alien. He'd built his own fortress, and I was standing outside, peering through a keyhole. Hours bled into each other. The coffee in my mug went cold, then lukewarm, then cold again. I was sifting through fragments, trying to piece together a narrative from digital dust. Then I found it. A single, unencrypted file. A video. It was grainy, shot with a low-resolution camera, likely a webcam. Finch was in it, looking older, more haggard than I'd seen him in the crime scene photos. He was in a dimly lit room, the kind I'd find in an abandoned factory. Bare concrete walls, exposed pipes. It's too powerful. It's not just a tool anymore. It's evolving, it's learning, and they want to weaponize it. I can't let them. I've hidden the core components, scattered them. If anything happens to me, find the keys, the real keys, not the ones they think they have. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound. The cipher is not just a message. It's the blueprint for the dispersal, the lock and the key. I have to understand. It's not about hiding information. It's about hiding the process, the very act of creation. He paused, his gaze fixing directly into the camera. They'll come for me. They already have. If I were watching this, it's too late for me, but not for the world. The world must not know what this can do. The loop, the sharp points, it's the answer. Finch wasn't just a cryptographer. He was involved in something dangerous, something he feared. And that cipher, it wasn't just a clue. It was a map to something that could change everything. The waxy smudge, the crystalline dust. It was starting to make a terrifying kind of sense. The video cut out abruptly, leaving me in the silence of my lab, the glow of the monitor illuminating my stunned face. And that cipher, it was a map. The implications of what I'd seen, what Finch had been trying to tell me, settled in my gut like a cold, hard stone. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a frantic energy buzzing beneath my skin. I needed to go back to the beginning, to the source of all this. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light. That's where it all started, with the victim. I needed to see him again, to look at him with fresh eyes, armed with this new, terrifying understanding. The drive, there was a blur. The city lights, usually a comforting tapestry, seemed to mark me with their indifference. Each blink of a street lamp felt like a judgment. Tonight, it felt different. Tonight, I wasn't just a forensic scientist doing my job. The air inside the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else, something more primal and unsettling. It always was. The body was still here, preserved, waiting. Finch. I approached the table, my gaze fixed on the still form. The initial examination had been thorough, meticulous even. But now, knowing what I knew, I searched for the details I might have overlooked. The precise angle of the ligature marks, the subtle bruising that suggested restraint, the faint trace of something under his fingernails that had been dismissed as residual dirt from his study. I remembered the initial report, the lack of any obvious struggle, the impossible locked room scenario. It had all pointed to an internal job, or something so sophisticated it defied logic. Now, logic felt like a flimsy shield. Back in my lab, the cipher pulsed on the screen. Finch's last desperate message. I'd spent days on it, running algorithms, cross-referencing known cryptographic methods. Nothing. It was unlike anything I'd encountered. But the video implied Finch had cracked it himself, or at least understood its significance. He'd mentioned a key, not a physical key, but something conceptual. I pulled up the fragments of Finch's digital footprint I'd managed to recover. His search history was a labyrinth of obscure historical texts, quantum computing theories, and most disturbingly, encrypted communication logs that I'd only managed to partially decrypt. One recurring phrase kept appearing: Project Nightingale. Project Nightingale. It sounded benign, almost poetic. Finch had been researching it, not as a cryptographer analyzing a puzzle, but as a man trying to understand a threat. I went back to the cipher, looking at it through the lens of Project Nightingale. What if it wasn't a message to someone, but a message about something? A way to describe a process, a system, a location. I started looking for patterns, not in letters, but in the structure of the cipher itself. The way certain symbols clustered, the subtle variations in their formation, was almost like a blueprint. Then a breakthrough. A small, almost insignificant detail I dismissed earlier. A series of darts and dashes, subtly different from the rest, embedded within a larger sequence. It wasn't Morse code, not directly, but it was a system of signaling, and it mapped onto something else I'd found in Finch's notes, a series of astronomical coordinates. I plotted the coordinates. They didn't point to a place on Earth. Not a city, not a landmark. They pointed to a specific point in the sky. A point that, according to Finch's astronomical charts, would be directly overhead a particular location on Earth at a very specific time. An abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. The one I'd driven past on my way to the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light. The pieces were clicking into place with a terrifying speed. Finch hadn't been murdered because of a debt or a personal vendetta. He'd been murdered because he was on the verge of exposing Project Nightingale, and he'd left behind a trail designed to be found, a trail that led to the very heart of it. The cipher wasn't just a clue, it was a warning and a testament. I felt a tremor run through me, not of fear, but of a grim determination. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. This was about understanding what Finch had discovered and why it was worth killing for. I looked at the screen, the deciphered fragments of Finch's message now starkly clear. They are not just communicating, they are controlling. Nightingale is the key to controlling the flow. Controlling what? Data, energy, information. The possibilities were dizzying, and each one more alarming than the last. I knew I had to go to that abandoned complex. I had to see what Finch had been so afraid of, what he had died to reveal. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, had been the beginning. This was the next step, a step into the unknown, a step that felt both inevitable and incredibly dangerous. The fluorescent hum of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was a familiar sound, usually a comfort in its predictability. Tonight, it felt like a taunt. The air, thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and final, did nothing to soothe the knot in my stomach. I'd come here hoping for a breakthrough, a whisper of insight from the victim, Finch, that the initial examination had missed. The body, still laid out on the cold steel table, offered nothing but silence. The chief medical examiner, a stoic woman with perpetually tired eyes, had granted me access. "He's all yours, William," he'd said, his voice low. "But don't expect miracles. The initial report is thorough." I ran my gloved fingers over the faint bruising on Finch's neck, the only external mark beyond the surgical incisions. The preliminary report had called it consistent with manual strangulation, but there was an odd, almost feathery quality to the pattern that didn't sit right. Too precise for a struggle. My breath fogged the cool metal of the table. Then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer under the stark light, near Finch's left ear. It wasn't a scar, not a birthmark. It looked like residue. I carefully scraped a tiny sample into a sterile vial. What kind of residue? It had a faint, almost oily sheen. Back in my lab, this would be my first order of business. But something else was nagging at me, a deeper unease that had been growing since I'd left Finch's apartment. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was a text from a burner number I didn't recognize. They know I'm looking. Stop. For my own good. My gut clenched. They. Who were they? The architects. The phantom group Finch had hinted at in his scrambled notes. This wasn't a warning, it was a threat, and it was specific. They knew I was looking into Finch's death. They knew I was the one looking. I looked back at Finch's still form. He hadn't just been a victim, he'd been a target. And now, it seemed, so was I. The predictable world of evidence, of logic and deduction, was suddenly spinning out of control. My analytical mind, usually my sharpest tool, felt clumsy and inadequate. A sudden noise from the corridor outside the suite made me freeze. My senses went on high alert. I wasn't armed, not in the conventional sense. My weapons were microscopes, chemical reagents, and an understanding of trace evidence. But against an unseen enemy, what good were they? I moved quietly, not towards the door, but towards the back of the suite, towards the heavy metal storage cabinets. I needed to think, to strategize, not just react. My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that could be used, anything that could be hidden. The text message flashed in my mind again. They know I'm looking. They weren't just watching, they were communicating. And they were letting me know they could reach me, even here. The abandoned complex Finch had mentioned. It wasn't just a place he was afraid of. It was a place he was trying to expose. I remembered the small, almost invisible puncture marks I'd noted on Finch's inner wrist during the initial examination, dismissed as insignificant. Now they felt ominous. What if the residue I'd collected wasn't from the cause of death, but from something else? Something injected, something that could track me. My mind raced, piecing together fragments. The impassable locked room, the unsolvable cipher, the cryptic warnings Finch had left, and now this direct threat. It wasn't just a murder investigation anymore. I was in the middle of something far bigger, far more dangerous. I needed to get out of here, but not just out of the autopsy suite. I needed to disappear, at least for a while. My apartment was compromised. My lab. Who knew? I had to assume I was being watched, that every move I made was being catalogued. I grabbed my forensic kit, the heavy case suddenly feeling like a shield. Inside, I had my tools, my knowledge. If they were using advanced methods, I had to counter with my own. If they were leaving digital footprints, I could trace them. If they were leaving physical ones, I could find them. The scuffing noise came again, closer this time. They weren't trying to break in, they were waiting, testing me. Or perhaps delivering a message. I looked at the body on the table one last time. Finch had been trying to tell the world something. He'd paid the ultimate price. Now it was my turn to try and finish what he started. But I had to survive first. My determination, once a steady flame, now burned with a desperate intensity. The game had changed. I wasn't just an investigator anymore. I was the quarry. And I had to use every ounce of my forensic skill, not just to solve a murder, but to stay alive. I needed to become invisible, a ghost in the system, before they found me. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. The sterile hum of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m. There was a familiar lullaby, but tonight it felt like a grinding saw. The single overhead light, a harsh white disc, bleached the color from everything, including my own face reflected dimly in the polished steel of the examination table. Finch's body lay beneath a thin sheet, a silent testament to the secrets he'd carried. The air, thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something colder, pressed in on me. They knew I was looking. The words echoed in my mind, a chilling whisper that had followed me from Finch's ransacked study. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. It was a certainty. The encrypted files, the scrambled messages, the sheer impossibility of his death, it all pointed to an unseen hand, a deliberate erasure. And that hand, I now believed, belonged to the architects. I ran a gloved finger over the faint etching on Finch's wrist, a symbol I'd finally deciphered from his last, desperate note. It wasn't a random doodle. It was a key. A subtle signature hidden in plain sight. It matched the fragmented insignia I'd found on a discarded data chip during my initial sweep of Finch's apartment. Small pieces, insignificant on their own, but when pieced together by a mind trained to see patterns in chaos, they formed a terrifying picture. They hadn't broken in, they had simply been there. Or rather, they had manipulated the environment, the very fabric of the room, to achieve their objective. My forensic training screamed against it, demanding tangible evidence, but Finch's life and death had been a constant defiance of the tangible. I leaned closer to Finch, my breath misting the cold air. "You left me breadcrumbs, didn't you, old man?" I murmured, my voice rough. He had anticipated this, had known he was a target. He had meticulously, almost artistically, laid out the trail for me. The cipher on his desk, the one I'd painstakingly worked through, wasn't just a puzzle. It was a confession, a roadmap. They didn't leave fingerprints. They left calculated absences, manipulated data, and a carefully constructed narrative of an accident or suicide. My eyes scanned the autopsy suite again. But Finch had shown me that finality was an illusion, a carefully crafted facade. He'd shown me how to look between the lines, how to see the digital ghosts that haunted the physical world. I pulled out my portable data reader, its screen a small beacon in the gloom. I had followed Finch's final, encrypted instructions, a series of commands that bypassed security protocols I didn't even know existed. He had directed me to a hidden partition on his personal server, a place he'd clearly believed was impregnable. But Finch had underestimated his own ingenuity. He had built a back door, a secret escape route, and he had left the key with me. The data flowed, a cascade of encrypted files that my specialized software, built on Finch's own foundational algorithms, began to unravel. It wasn't just financial records or corporate espionage. It was something far grander, far more terrifying. The architects weren't a company or a government agency. They were a collective, an invisible network that manipulated global events, not with bombs or bullets, but with information. They controlled narratives, orchestrated market crashes, and it seemed decided who lived and who died. Hands trembled, not from fear, but from a raw, exhilarating certainty. Finch hadn't been murdered in a locked room. He had been erased from the room, his presence digitally scrubbed, his demise framed as a natural event. The cipher hadn't been a cry for help. It had been a blueprint for justice. The data stream slowed, then stopped. The final file opened, not with text, but with an audio recording. Finch's voice, surprisingly calm, filled the autopsy suite. "William," he began, the sound tinny and distorted. "If I am hearing this, then I have failed. But I, my friend, have succeeded. They are everywhere, yet nowhere. Their strength lies in their anonymity, their power in our ignorance. This recording is their undoing. It contains proof, undeniable proof, of their existence and their methods. I have embedded it within the very fabric of the global communication network, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the eyes to see. The key to its release, the trigger, is the symbol on my wrist. The architects had underestimated Finch. They had underestimated me. They were wrong. I looked at Finch's still form, a silent promise passing between us. He had given me the weapon, now it was my turn to wield it. The data I had acquired wasn't just evidence, it was a detonator. I knew how to release it, how to flood the world with the architect's carefully guarded secrets. It would be chaos, global upheaval, but it was a necessary one. The single overhead light felt like a spotlight, illuminating the path I had to take. It wouldn't be easy. They would fight back, and they would fight dirty. But I had Finch's legacy, his final, brilliant act of defiance, and the knowledge that the truth, no matter how hidden, always finds a way to surface. I stood up, my gaze fixed on the sheet covering Finch. The confrontation was over. The resolution, however, was just beginning. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was always heavy. Today, it felt like a shroud. The sterile scent of disinfectant did little to mask the underlying metallic tang that clung to everything. I stood by the stainless steel table, the harsh light glinting off its surface. Finch's body lay beneath a sheet, a stark reminder of the labyrinth I'd stumbled into. The architects. The words still tasted like ash in my mouth. They thought they'd won. They thought silencing him, and perhaps me, would be enough. I ran a gloved hand over my jaw. It had been a week since the discovery, a week of chasing shadows and deciphering whispers. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a gnawing unease. The locked room, the impassable cipher, Finch's quiet brilliance, it all pointed to something far more intricate than a simple homicide. My job had always been about tangible evidence, about what I could see, touch, and measure. But Finch's world, the one he'd meticulously constructed in his digital fortress, defied such easy categorization. I'd spent hours poring over his encrypted files, wrestling with algorithms that seemed to shift and reform before my eyes. It was like trying to grasp smoke. The architects had left no fingerprints, no forced entry, no discernible motive beyond silencing him. But they had left something. They'd left Finch's final message, embedded in the very cipher that had baffled everyone else. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a testament. My gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where a small, nondescript USB drive sat on a tray. It was the only thing I'd found on Finch's person that wasn't part of his usual attire. Unassuming, yet it held the key. The architects had been so focused on the physical impassibility of the crime, they'd overlooked the digital breadcrumbs. Finch, even in death, had outmaneuvered them. I remembered the moment I'd finally cracked the outer layer of his final cipher. It wasn't a code designed to be broken by brute force. It was a layered puzzle, each solved segment revealing the key to the next, a digital breadcrumb trail leading not to a perpetrator, but to a truth. The truth was that Finch hadn't been murdered by an external force. The architects hadn't breached his sanctuary. They'd merely amplified his own creation. A chill, unrelated to the ambient temperature, snaked down my spine. The implications were enormous. Finch had been on the verge of exposing them, of revealing the vast network they'd built, a network that manipulated information, controlled narratives, and wielded power through unseen channels. He'd known they were coming. He'd known they would try to stop him, and he'd prepared for it. The cipher wasn't a cry for help. It was a confession and a final act of defiance. The complex encryption, the seemingly unsolvable nature of it, was a deliberate misdirection. It was designed to make the investigators look for an external killer, for a physical breach. But the true message, the damning evidence against the architects, was hidden within the very structure of the cipher itself. Finch had used his own death and the ensuing investigation as the final key. He'd orchestrated it. The realization settled over me, heavy and profound. He hadn't been a victim in the traditional sense. He had been a martyr, yes, but also a strategist. He had weaponized his own demise. I looked down at my hands, still clad in latex gloves. My profession was built on certainty, on the irrefutable nature of scientific fact. But Finch had shown me that even the most secure systems, the most concrete realities, could be bent, twisted, and redefined. He had blurred the lines between the digital and the physical, between life and death, between evidence and intent. The architects believed they had erased Finch, but they had only amplified his voice. It was in the way he'd forced me to question everything I thought I knew. It was in the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bullet, but a well-crafted lie, and the most effective defense, a truth so complex it becomes its own shield. I reached for my phone, my fingers finding the familiar smooth surface. It was time to share what I'd found. They had underestimated his foresight, his courage, and his ability to leave a message that would echo long after his last breath. And in their arrogance, they had underestimated me, the forensic scientist who could see beyond the bloodstains and broken locks, into the intricate, invisible architecture of truth. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.